Let's come to the 26th presentation in this year-long series. And we're looking at a pivot. The strongest shapes are those that have a rotational quality to them, a dynamic geometry. And it is that rotation that generates an angular momentum, which is very important in calculating what the dynamics are in physics and chemistry and so forth, but also in what we've come to understand of spiritual matters. The pairedness extends to angular momentum because there are two complementarity rotations. There's a right-handed and a left-handed, and these two were emphasized in the ancient Arans posture of prayer. When one was going to pray, it was in this mode and not in this mode yet. This mode came in with the idea of prayer. This was the presentation of prayer. You find this 4,000 years ago at the beginning of Zarathustra's Gathas. And in my translation of the very beginning of the Gathas, it reads like this: Ah, to the highest I pray, with hands spread aloft, to Spirit Mazda, first and pure, in Asha as ordered deeds. Our good Herod mind, this pleases creation's soul. Herod is the power of manifesting. It's like Te in Tao Te Ching. The Te means that it has the power to be, to emerge and be. So this Herod is the basis of the integral, of the oneness, of the unity, of the way in which phenomenality is empirically based. And when this is so, the good Herod mind of the praiser, the prayer, does this in a double feminine context. Asha as the order of existence, the ordering of existence, she guarantees this, and Mazda, who is the eternal feminine wisdom, the radiance of being able to accept the praise in that it is presented in Asha's order, the good Herod mind then is called Vohuman, as a spirit helper, who has a complement to, as a good ordered mind, to Asha, and the pairing of them together is able to have Mazda have the pair of expression and existence of Ahura. That the Lord of that eternal radiance comes into play, comes not just into play, but into play in being, in this realm in which we have life. And one of the very earliest qualities of this is in the most ancient understanding of a hero who is paired, who must, in times of danger, in situations of an enemy, in a swamping of the good by the evil, by the pure, by the impure, a pair of heroes comes into play. And that pair of heroes is so universal, it also takes part in the Navajo war ceremony, the preparing of men to go into battle in enemy territory and to be able to return to the safety of the home, of the clan, of the tribe, of the life, the family, which the women ensure is not only there but real. And so in the two come to the father, one of the heroes is called Monster Slayer, and the other one has a very interesting kind of name. The description of the second hero is child born of water, which sounds kind of innocuous initially until one understands. Their journey together, Monster Slayer and child born of water, to the house of the sun in search of their supernatural father, and their return to earth full of strength and wisdom. Mother Nature is able to ensure that life has a wholeness to it, has an acceptance that allows for a whole scalar of kaleidoscopic flexibility, and this can only be ensured if the masculine is able to go into these very difficult mythic trials in times of great danger, in times where the enemy is overpowering, where the evil is sweeping. And it is in that situation that something occurs. In this particular volume, when the two came to the father, it was the very first book in the Bollingen series, originally published in 1943, right in the depths of World War II, in the darkest hours of the world at that time, January 1943. And Bollingen, as a series, was thought of, commissioned by Mary Mellon, who was this magisterial, spiritual, ancient, feminine, who guaranteed that life would be whole, even and especially in times of dire enemy evil swallowing up the world. Mary Mellon was the wife of Paul Mellon, who was the son of one of the richest men in America, Andrew Mellon. The Carnegie Mellon families were extremely philanthropic, and Paul, when he married Mary, saw that they were going to have a strenuous life of maintaining themselves. And it was in that context that they began to take Jungian therapy, and finally contacted Jung and began to go to Europe to listen to his presentation, lecture seminars. Dream Analysis was the first one they went to in the late 30s. And in 1940, when it was apparent that the winter lull after the invasion of Poland in September 1939, as soon as the weather broke in the late winter, early spring of 1940, the Nazis invaded and quickly took over Denmark and Norway, and by October of 1940, they had taken over France. It was a swift, catastrophic falling, and at that time, Mary Mellon and her husband Paul were with Jung in his home in the small village of Bollingen, just south of Zurich. And it was there that they began to lay out a plan that had been drawn up by Heinrich Zemmer, who was the great writer of things to do with India, and 5 or 6 of his books are in the Bollingen series. Philosophies of India was the first one I read at 20 years of age at the University of Wisconsin. And The Highest Good is the first part. The Philosophies of Time is the second part. The Philosophies of Eternity is the third part. And you can see the carefulness of Zemmer to be able to layer in such a way that the layers are flows of achievement. And these flows of achievement, in order to begin to essay on undertaking this, there has to be a pilgrimage of the 2 aspects, of the monster slayer aspect, of the child born of water aspect. And among the volumes in the Bollingen series, on the 89th series, there are 3 volumes together that make the 89th. The Bollingen series had 100 numbers, Roman numeral numbers. Ananda Kumaswari, who was another Indian savant, and his little book, the Rig Veda as Land Nama Book. It means the Rig Veda as a way of naming so that one can understand how reality works, even in existence, especially in existence under evil duress, where the enemy nature has taken an upper hand and seems invincible. It is then that the eternal quality comes into play through the time calibration redone, a recalibration, so that then one has the highest good, is able to rise up from original, fresh creation, not reforming something that had already been created, not trying to patch together, not trying to fit together again things that had happened, but now this was a fresh, we used to in the 60s say it was a happening. It was a gerund. It was a freshly now happening, but not now in a present, but happening in presence. That has a reverberation, where the monster slayer will have the courage to do that, and the child born of water is, as the phrase goes, the sun rising from the primordial waters. And the very first illustration in Kumaraswami's little Rig Veda as Land Nama book, it was published in London 1935, about the time that thinking people realized that the Nazis were intent on a Third Reich. The very first illustration is the sun coming up out of the primordial waters, the sun rising. And it is this rising that then makes a holy sunrise. And this is something that is the dawn. And the original dawn in Indian mythology was that as soon as the mother of Siddhartha, the Buddha, realized that she had had a conception during that night, she was alert to this new energy calibration coming into life within her that she was carrying, just the beginnings of the gestation, the conception. And the realization of the conception coincided with the dawn of that day, with the sun coming above, the proverbial waters above, waters below, confluence, that double rotation. She then understood that this one is the child born of these waters, who will be accompanied by monster slayer to be able to effect the transformation, the recalibration of a world susceptible to evil to an overcoming of that evil in the most complete possible way. Not a way of killing it, but a way of putting it into a solution where it is dissolved and made into its opposite, made into fructification rather than evil. To, like an aikido, taking that energy of the evil and turning it back upon the sender in the sense that it recalibrates. The quality in when the two came to the Father was 18 sand paintings by the Navajo tribe, because they were sending their young men into battle in World War II, because it had been decided that an unbreakable code was the Navajo language, that if you do not grow up with it, you cannot learn it. If it is not native to you, you cannot learn it, and it has such a difficult declensioning. American Indian languages not only have 3-time tenses, they have 6. So that Navajo especially is extremely difficult. And these sand paintings have at the center of the chirality a symbol. And I long ago extracted that symbol so it could be understood that it is a double chiral that has a single entrance way. And only by that entrance way, following the double chiral, is it possible then that the great serpent energies, that 4 great serpent energies can enter into participation in the double chirality and give us a way out of the situation, which can be likened to a maze. And that maze can be handled. This particular edition of When the Two Came to the Father is actually a second edition done in 1969. The first edition was kind of a large square. The Philosophic Research Society had an original 1943 edition of it, and it had silk-screened plates. This one had very good printing, but it didn't have the same texture. But this second edition had many additions to it, done by Maud Oakes, who interviewed the shaman Jeff King of the Navajo tribe, and edited by Joseph Campbell, a young Joseph Campbell, because Joseph Campbell had been made the literary executor for Heinrich Zimmer, who had died. He was in New York City lecturing at Columbia University, delivering great series, and he caught pneumonia and died. And it was Campbell who took over editing all of the unpublished manuscripts of Heinrich Zimmer. And Maud Oakes was the great translator who could take Jeff King's Navajo language and put it into an English language. This whole quality of Mary Mellon is exemplified in a little volume published by the Chiron Press which is a Jungian press. C.G. Jung, his friendship with Mary Mellon, and a writer, J.B. Priestley, who did an anthology on literatures and time at one point. Consistent with this is that whenever there is a crisis, there is a crisis on the scale of life. The feminine wisdom is what is the trustworthy context within which all the theater of effectiveness will transpire and take place. So that it is the hero who must understand that context has no boundaries, that feminine wisdom has an eternal quality to it, and in doing so, the actions of the masculine gain not only a poignancy, but gain a poignancy that has for its stretching meaning an eternal quality. When it comes to the way in which India presented the feminine, it was very strange how Indian feminine wisdom came to dominate the way in which the West finally came to understand it for the first time. When you look at the beginnings of Sanskrit as a language that could be read by a Western avant-garde appreciative audience, Max Muller in the middle of the 19th century began to make translations and to garner translations from various avant-garde scholars and to publish all of these eventually over several decades as the Sacred Books of the East in 50 volumes. But one of the aspects was missing, and that was the appreciation of the feminine wisdom participating as the necessary context within which life is brought back into not just its integral wholeness, but also into its differential scalar of eternal, all possible worlds application. The figure who initially brought this into play took a pen named Arthur Avalon. His name was John Woodroffe. He became Sir John Woodroffe. And Sir John Woodroffe, with his volume, The Serpent Power, this is a 1919 early edition of The Serpent Power, was the culminating work in a whole series of works that Arthur Avalon penned or brought together people, and they were known as the Tantric texts. And there were 12 of them in a series of volumes, much like the Sacred Books of the East, but closer to the Bollingen series that would come 2 generations later. And Sir John Woodroffe was a peculiar person. He was knighted for his service in India. He worked his way up the pecking order until he became the head judge in India under the British Raj. And his place was to understand from especially the Bengal association in the north with the Tamil association in the south, that somehow the strongest yogas in Indian history, in the whole heritage of India, had a mixture of that north and that south, and that the north had a particular quality of organization along Vedic lines, whereas the South had a very strange particular association with what was there in India before there were Vedas. The Vedas go back to about 3,500 years. The ancient India goes back 35,000 years. It is the feminine mother goddess who came to be characterized later as Durga in the fierce mode of protecting life, protecting love, as it were, protecting the interchanges, and it is this quality of Durga that most beautifully presents itself in the Mahanirvana Tantra. And it was Sir John Woodroffe, as Arthur Avalon, who collected all of the variants and produced a Sanskrit text of the Mahanirvana, not just nirvana. Nirvana is a masculine idea of attainment. The attainment of what might be called and was called moksha, the extinction of all the impurities. But there is such a thing as a great nirvana, a maha-nirvana, which does not stop with having stopped, but continues through the stoppage into the beyond. And it is this bridging of the stopping, which is actually a gap, because what was complicated can no longer continue because it has run out of connections. It has run out of juice. It has no dynamic. It has no causality. And so it doesn't work anymore. In fact, if it identified with working, with its triumphs, it no longer exists at all. But there's a beyond. And the Maha-Nirvana Tantra is the only place that one finds in the long introduction. This text is over 500 pages in Sanskrit. That Woodroffe made sure that the funding was there, it was published, it was edited right, and he took charge of all of it in his, quote, spare time, while he was writing a dozen other books on Tantra, because it is Tantra that comes into play beyond the sutras. The sutras are the way in which the masculine comes together as a community, as the Sanskrit word is asanga, a sangha collected in the Dharma that is delivered by the Buddha. And so the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha are like baskets of wisdom, and these three baskets, in Sanskrit the word is pitaka, and so the three is the Tripitaka, the three baskets. And it is that quality then that the Maha-Nirvana Tantra goes beyond, where the sutras come to not just a stopping, but a vanishing of the stopping itself, by the vanishing of any aspect that could be continued. It is important in his 50-page introduction to the Maha-Nirvana Tantra that you find out that he was married. His wife was named Ellen, and her maiden name was Avalon. Now, there's a recent book by Kathleen Taylor. This is the first illustration I showed you is the cover of her book, saying, well, this is all due to an Arthurian thing. Arthur for King Arthur, and Avalon for where King Arthur was buried. And he took this as a pseudonym because he was looking at it as a Celtic mystery play, that the Tantras are all about this. And interestingly, all of that is true. All of that is remarkably insightful. And we'll talk more about how insightful that is in some of the coming presentations. But in addition, it was the maiden name of his wife. His relationship with Ellen was the way in which Sir John Woodroffe became Arthur Avalon, able to introduce not only to the West the Tantras, but to bring the Tantras out of obscurity in India itself. That they had fallen into an obscurity of centuries. Nobody talked about them. It was not a nice subject. This is about sex. This is about the dynamic of sex. But it is resonant to such an extent that one begins to see a scalar. It's about life and love in their chiralities. And when they are balanced in their chiralities, the Arans informs the language so that it is a language of praise and prayer at the same time. And out of this, the Indian understanding of a poetic originally came long, long ago, which is different from the Vedas. It has a different quality and tone. It has an originality that when it comes into play, one is overcome by the sudden wonderful aspect. And in the later years of Arthur Avalon, there came to be in Bengal one of the greatest Indian poets of all time. His name was Rabindranath Tagore. And the greatest European poet of the day in the late 1900s, early 20th century, W.B. Yeats befriended Tagore and tendered him in 1913 for the Nobel Prize in Literature, which Tagore won, and became a household name around the world. When we come back from the break, we'll take a look at how the Maha Nirvana Tantra with Arthur Avalon and his serpent power and Rabindranath Tagore produced a quality of genius in India, Surendranath Dasgupta, who took his cue from Arthur Avalon, only he applied himself to the entire range of unpublished, unread manuscripts and wrote a first history of Indian philosophy, lived long enough to be almost finished with volume 5. Let's take a break and come back.